Merlin the wizard. His name alone conjures up images of an old wise mage protector of the young King Arthur and master of foresight manipulating the course of history to usher in an age of peace and prosperity under the banner of the once and future king. It's no wonder that Merlin remains one of the most enduring figures in Arthurian lore and even in popular culture, frequently portrayed by actors like Anthony Head in BBC's Merlin, or even voiced by the great John Cleese in Disney's The Sword in the Stone. Merlin may not be as well known as King Arthur himself, but his name has become synonymous with the magical arts, particularly the idea of a mentor figure guiding a younger hero towards their destiny. But while Merlin is remembered as a source of wisdom, insight, and all-around awesomeness, the truth of the matter is that he's actually a lot stranger, darker, and altogether more disturbing than you might think. So join me today as we look at 5 dark secrets of Merlin the Wizard, because it turns out that legend's greatest mage had some serious issues. And stick around to the end where I reveal a brand new secret, one that no one knows about and which I discovered only recently myself. And now back to the video. Let's begin with a bang. Merlin wasn't just a wizard. He was the literal son of a demon. In Geoffrey of Monmouth's influential 12th century text, The History of the Kings of Britain, we learn that Merlin was born of a human father named Ambrosius, who was himself the illegitimate son of King Aurelius Conan. However, Merlin's mother wasn't a mere mortal. No, she was a demon who fell in love with a local lord named Uwaine and had a son with him. When Uwaine's wife bore their child, she was so horrified at the sight of her husband's demonic son that she threw him into a nearby lake, intending for him to drown. But as the babe was being pulled underwater, a water spirit rescued him and brought him to a nearby nunnery where he was suckled by a tigress until such time as his mother returned from the dead and claimed him as her own. That's right. After killing herself by throwing herself into a river, Merlin's mom came back from the dead to take him in, presumably because the demon world doesn't have quite the same rules when it comes to raising children. This weird, wild tale tells us 2 things. First, demons are apparently real, at least in this version of the British Isles, and second, Merlin was half demon, half human, making him an incredibly powerful sorcerer indeed. Speaking of magic users, now let's turn to the latest discovery regarding Merlin's origins. Now this one's gonna take a bit of explaining, so bear with me here. You see, before I dove deep into writing my novel, The Last Kingdom of Fairy, I read everything I could get my hands on about medieval magic, folklore, and paganism. And during my research, I kept coming across this guy, a man named Dros the Long. In Welsh folklore, Dros is basically a tricksy fairy who lives in the sea and shapeshifts into beautiful women to tempt unsuspecting mortals. But there's another thing he's known for, namely the fact that he too supposedly sired a child with a woman named Ambrosia. What's the name of that child? Merlin. Of course, now it's at this point that you might accuse me of simply pulling these 2 figures together because they both have links to Ambrosia and the name Merlin, and that would be absolutely correct. But it's important to remember that Geoffrey of Monmouth, the man credited with establishing Merlin as a central character in Arthurian lore, lived in the 12th century. The story of Dros, however, can be found in a medieval manuscript dating back to the 9th century. In other words, it predates Geoffrey by at least 300 years. What's more, it's possible that Dros was based on a real historical person, specifically a member of an ancient order of Celtic druids known as the Vaticani. According to some scholars, the Vaticani were a secretive group of Welsh druids who functioned kind of like shamans, traveling from place to place and acting as intermediaries between the living and the dead. They were also said to be incredibly knowledgeable in matters of herbalism and healing, skills that may have been passed down to later healers like Dros, or even Merlin himself. What I'm getting at here is that there's good reason to believe that Merlin was originally conceived as a pagan druid, someone with powers rooted in the old ways of magic, rather than the more traditional image of a wizard with a pointy hat and a penchant for arcane spells. Now, if we accept that Merlin began life as a pagan, it makes sense that he would have used his knowledge of the old gods to manipulate those around him, especially when it came to Arthur. See, Merlin's relationship with Arthur is a complicated one. On the one hand, Merlin clearly cares deeply about the young prince and feels compelled to protect him and help him fulfill his destiny. On the other hand, Merlin is also extremely controlling, often dictating how Arthur should act and what decisions he should make. For instance, Merlin is the one who convinces Arthur to marry Guinevere, even though it's clear that she's in love with Lancelot. And he's also the one who arranges for Arthur to be crowned king in the first place. So why does Merlin have such a tight grip on Arthur's life? Well, the answer is simple: power. You see, Merlin uses his prophecies to get what he wants, telling Arthur that he will be destined for greatness if he marries Guinevere and becomes king. But we all know that these prophecies aren't set in stone. They're simply manipulations on Merlin's part, allowing him to maintain control of Arthur and keep him dependent upon Merlin's guidance. In a way, Merlin is like a religious zealot, determined to impose his beliefs on others, whether they like it or not. Just as many Christians in the Middle Ages saw it as their duty to convert people to Christianity, Merlin sees it as his duty to usher in the age of Arthur, even if it means bending the truth or outright lying to achieve his goals. Let's be honest. If someone told you that your best friend was destined to become the most powerful king in the land, you'd probably be pretty excited. But what if that same person then proceeded to tell you that your best friend needed to marry a woman he didn't love and that he needed to become king despite having no desire for the throne? You might start to think that this person was a little crazy, and that's exactly how Merlin's followers felt about him after hearing his insane prophecies. Yes, Merlin went mad. And if you think that sounds like a fun adventure where Merlin goes off on a quest to find the philosopher's stone or maybe travels back in time to prevent the destruction of Atlantis, well, think again. Merlin's madness is depicted in vivid detail in one of the most disturbing passages in all of Arthurian lore, The Death of Merlin by Robert de Boron. Here we find Merlin in his dotage, ranting and raving about topics that make no sense to anyone around him, including his former apprentice, Galahad. At one point, Merlin says, "Beware, Galahad, beware of the dolorous stroke of mid-12 o'clock," to which Galahad responds, "What stroke mean ye?" Merlin replies, "I speak not of bodily stroke, but of treason and death." To which Galahad asks, "Who shall do you treason and slay you?" And Merlin answers cryptically, "He that shall be nigh you, and he that shall be yaff you, and he that shall be yaff you," before leaving Galahad and retreating into the woods to live out the rest of his days as a hermit. Merlin warns Galahad that he will die by the hands of two people close to him, one who lives near him and another who will betray him. Now, before you go thinking that Merlin's just a bit of a Nostradamus and that his cryptic pronouncements are just a bit difficult to understand, let me point out that the language of the original text is anything but cryptic. In fact, it's quite clear that Merlin is raving incoherently. And the fact that Galahad is unable to understand what Merlin is saying demonstrates just how unhinged Merlin's mind has become. Merlin has gone completely mad and is now just a shell of his former self, muttering to himself and unable to function properly in society. We've covered Merlin's madness, his lust for power, and his possible origins as a pagan druid. But what about his tragic romance with a lover who trapped him forever? Well, it all starts with Nimue, a mysterious sorceress who shows up at Merlin's castle one day and demands that he teach her the secrets of his magic. Merlin agrees, but he quickly finds himself falling in love with Nimue, a feeling that's only reciprocated by the sorceress. Unfortunately for our boy Merlin, Nimue has a dark side, a bloodlust that causes her to kill anyone who crosses her. And so when Merlin tries to break off their affair, after realizing that he can't control Nimue's murderous impulses, she holds him captive in a cave for 5 years, slowly draining his power until he eventually dies of exhaustion. However, before Merlin passes on, he imparts some of his powers onto Nimue, transforming her into a new and improved version of himself, complete with a pointy hat, long beard, and staff. She then becomes the Lady of the Lake, guardian of the mystical sword Excalibur, which will one day be wielded by King Arthur. Thank you so much for watching.